I'm Dean Cifola, and this is the Azure Academy. So we're going to pick up where we left off last time. So we had created a three-tiered application inside of an ARM template, and we were deploying a web server that we were going to get a web page that was customized, had the name of our server on it, and so this was our layout. And so what we want to do here is we want to kick it up a notch. So we had this ARM template, and this is definitely good by itself, but I wanted to show you how to expand on this. So how can we scale this so that we get more of a modular approach to deploying our templates, as well as encapsulate each one of these sections that's doing a particular job so that they can be not only reused in this task, but for other tasks. So for that, first thing we want to do is look back at our portal and go to our documentation. Okay, and under Products, we're going to go to Management Tools and Resource Manager. And under the How to Create Templates, we want to talk about linked and nested templates. So what is a linked or nested template? So a linked is where we have a separate template like we had over here, okay? And a nested template is one that is built in line inside a template. Now, what are the benefits here? So when you're doing a linked template, you can have them totally separate, so you keep them modular. So I could have a web server template that is the generic template of web servers that I can deploy anytime I use a web server anywhere, or an app server, database server, domain controller, file server, etc. And that helps me to be able to scale and reuse them as much as possible. Now, that versus a nested template, I can still do the same approach, but I do the whole thing in line. So I create a deployment section here of my resource type of deployment, and in there I have separate resources that I can deploy in the same template. So I don't have to have multiple templates to manage, but there are some limitations. So for example, when I'm doing a inline or nested template, I cannot create myself a separate parameters section here, a separate variable section. I'm limited to just basically the resources section. So depending on what it is that you're trying to do, one may work better than the other, and I'm going to show you examples today of using both. So for that, we'll put aside our portal. So what we're going to do is we're going to basically recreate our deployment here, our three-tiered deployment, but we're going to do it as nested and inline templates so that you can see what that is like. And we're going to do it based on these templates that we've already got, and we'll just be taking a bunch of these sections and redoing them and spreading them out into multiple templates. So first thing is we will create a folder, and we'll call this nested templates. Now, this is a good time to point out that when you are referencing nested templates through linking, they are case sensitive. So if you have a capital letter anywhere in here, then you have to reproduce it, and I'll show you some of that as we go. Now, to do this, we need a master template to deploy all of the others. So we're going to deploy a new template. We'll just call it Azure Deploy. That's perfectly fine. And we're going to need, as well, a parameters file. Now this is going to become the master template of which we then deploy all the other templates. So for that, we're going to start off with our basic parameters that we have here. So we'll just copy those into our parameters section. And let's also be mindful of any of the important variables that we had. So we're going to need, let's see, VM images for sure, because we want to still be able to deploy Windows or Linux. And we're going to need another one for templates, and we're going to put in there the links to the other templates that we're going to create. Okay, so our planned layout is we'll have a deployment of a virtual network, a web server, app server, and database server. And now inside the templates variable, what we want to do is want to create a section of which we can then call each one of the particular items that we're looking for. Okay, and now that we've created the framework for those, now we have to give it the information that tells us how to find the particular file that we wanted to deploy. Now to do this, we need two more parameters. And this section here, this is going to depend on whether or not you're deploying from something like Visual Studio Team Services, GitHub, a local repository on your own system. But Visual Studio and ARM templates have a way to do this that's called a artifact location. So let me add these parameters. Okay, and these are found in Visual Studio by default, so I'm not creating anything magical here. But what it's basically going to do is say whatever place I'm uploading, or whatever Azure storage account, or GitHub, or whatever I'm putting my templates in, that's my artifact location. And then the SAS token is the permissions or string, password, whatever it is that I'm using to gain access to that location. And since I'll be storing these in a Azure storage account, I'm going to be generating a SAS token on the fly so that I can interact with my templates securely. Now with that, let me fill in the details here and then explain to you what we've got. What we have created here is a concatenation, and that was our one of our functions, to the artifact location. So that's going to be http:// storage account name / nested templates, because that's the name of my folder, / the name of the particular template, and you see they will be case sensitive. And then I put in the parameter of the artifact SAS token. So the way that the entire string ends up looking when you do a deployment is, http:// storage account name / nested templates / database.json, and then it's going to have the string, which starts off with a question mark. And then it's going to be a really long string, and that's your token. So that's the actual location. Now, if you are storing your stuff in GitHub, then you would change this or add a default location here to your GitHub repository, and then all the rest of this would be the same, and the artifact token would actually be blank, because you don't need it if you're using a public GitHub repo. If you're using a private repo, you need a token. Okay, so that's our template section. What we had here in our VM sizes, now I want to be able to deploy my web servers in a different way than I'm deploying my database servers, because if I deploy a F2 size web server, I may need a completely different size database server. So let's change this VM sizes parameter, and now I'm just determining that the system that I'm deploying, my 3-tiered app, is either going to be small, medium, or large configuration. Now, to further refine that into something actually meaningful, I'm going to then create a variable, and now my variable is going to be calling out small, medium, and large, and those are my specified sizes for a small, medium, or large environment. Okay, so that's just another way to add some scale and diversity in your deployment. So now that we've deployed that, I also want to specify that sometimes I may not want to deploy all 3 tiers. Maybe I just want the web tier. Maybe I just want a database. Maybe I just need an app and a database. So I want to add a parameter here, and this is going to use something that we haven't done before. And now this is a Boolean parameter, so its values are only true or false, and notice there are no quotes around those. And the default value is true. So I'm taking my web, app, and database servers and saying that if I select this value as true, then actually do the deployment. And I'll show you that when we get to building our resources. That'll be a condition that we'll add. Now, I also specified I'm building a virtual network. So in order to do that, I want to be able to generate a IP segment that I'm going to build this network on. So let's add that as a parameter. Okay, so what I've added here is the ability to specify the first 2 octets of an IP address and then leave the last 2 blank. So I'm codifying that by saying that the minimum length that this particular value can be is 4 characters. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. So the minimum that I'm doing has to be something that has at least 2 characters So maybe I could do even something like this. I mean, that's completely ridiculous, but you could, in theory. It's not a valid IP, but whatever. And then a maximum of 12. So that would be having 3 characters for each octet set, making it 12 characters. So then, based on that, I've got to then manage my virtual network so that I'm getting all of the other IPs specified within that range. So when I specify the IP addresses for my devices going to appear on my network, I'm specifying the last 2 and using this as an input parameter. You'll see what I mean in a minute. Now here's where we're actually going to do our deployment. So we're going to start off with our virtual network. So let me fill that in here. And this is using a resource type of Microsoft.resource/deployments. So this is going to generate a deployment for us, and the deployment is called deploy virtual network. I could have literally called it anything. And it also has an API version because it's a resource, and it has some properties. And it also can have a depends on. Deployments cannot have tags, but they can have copy loops. So we'll come back to that in a second. And then here's the other things that make it unique. So it has the template link, because this is a linked deployment linking to our virtual network. And this linked deployment has a URI, so we know where to find it. And that's from our variable virtual network. So template, variable, virtual network, and then link, because that's what I wanted to call this. I could have called this little piggy. Didn't matter. So that's how it knows how to find which particular template to deploy. Then it has a content version, and just like a regular template does. And then it has a mode. Now there are basically 2 modes today. There is incremental and complete. Now, incremental is the one that you should be using. Complete mode you should only use if you are very well aware of the consequences and implications of using it. When you say complete, you give the deployment a template, and that deployment goes to a resource group. Complete mode says, I don't care what's here, I don't care what it looks like, make it look like this template. So if you have resources inside a resource group that are not specified or set up the same way as they are in your template, it will delete them. Okay, so do not use complete mode unless you are very sure that you have a static environment like a lab setting or a certified environment that it must always be like this, and you want to use the templates to enforce that the environment remains the same. Besides that, only use incremental. Okay, now when I'm doing a linked deployment, I can specify parameters, and the parameters could have any values. They don't have to be from my parameters section. I'm doing that because I want to pass these values downline to my virtual network, like my IP address space and my prefix that we've talked about earlier. So I want to give those values to my template of virtual network. Okay, so I'm planning ahead. Okay, remember, we begin with a plan. And we're going to take our virtual network from our tiered deployment, which is this guy, and we're basically going to start with that. Okay. Now, we'll tweak this up a little bit, and I'll do it really quick here just to save time, and then we'll go back and talk about what I've done. We have our deployment, which is a linked deployment. And that then feeds in 2 parameters. So the first thing that you have to know about doing linked templates is that when you have parameters from the master side, those parameters need to exist in exactly the same way on the linked side. However, there is a particular difference. When I entered these parameter values up here, okay, so we had all this information. We had a default value, we had a length here, and it was a type of a string. This is a type of a string, but it looks different when we look at it on the linked side. Now, I could have put those things in here, but they're unnecessary because I've already set that at the beginning. All I need to do is take whatever value is put in for the IP and for the prefix, because they're going to be forced to comply with my standards, because that's what I set them up here for, and just pass those values through my parameter down to my linked template. So I only need the basics here. I need a string, it's an integer, it's Boolean, it's whatever it is. So I only need the very basics. Okay, so that's why this looks a little bit different. Now, in my variables section, what I've added here, and I talked about this in a previous video, is there are many different ways that you can build out resources. You can put everything in line inside the resource. You could also use something like a variable section. So I thought I would do that for you here. So what I've got is a variable I created called virtual network information, vnet info, and that's where I'm specifying the name and the IP address and the NSG names of the things that I'm going to be creating in my resources. So I have my name of my virtual network. Starts off with my prefix, which we get from our input parameter when the master is kicked off. That's passed to my link template, comes in as a parameter, and then it functions normally. So the parameter of prefix, whatever it is, Z99, PXN93, whatever, that then is going to be part of the name of my virtual network. And it's also going to be part of the name of my network security groups. Then I'm taking the IP values, and the IP values come in from the IP address, so the first two octets, and then I'm filling in the rest of the information here. So I'm always choosing, no matter if I'm doing a 10.0, a 172.16, a 192.168 network, doesn't matter what it is that I'm building, 100.12, anything. And then I'm filling in the back half of that address space of particular subnets that I want to deploy. Okay, so from here, let's look at our resources. Okay, so here's our address space that we're using, and now we're relying on our variables vnet info, and then we have the copy index. Now we looked at some of this already in our last template, but the copy index just tells us which number of the deployment are we doing. Now there's only one virtual network info, but if you've been paying attention, what that means is I could also create another one, and I could call this hub, and I could create another one and call this spoke. And I can deploy multiple networks just by adding more things in my variables section here, changing the values around a little bit so that they can communicate with each other. And by doing that, I leave this code in my resource section the same, and I just add more stuff in the variables, and I can now do multiple iterations of this same deployment, build it, scale it for whatever I need. Maybe I'm doing a app environment that requires dev, test, prod, and QA. Well, I could just add here vnet info dev, test, prod, QA, and deploy all of them all at once. So it just depends on what it is that you need to do. But we're calling our address space from our variable, which is up here. And we end up with all of the same values that we deployed our original template with. And we end up with the same value because we're putting in the first half of the IP in our input parameter and the last half inside the template itself. Now, all of our subnets function basically the same way. Okay, so we're deploying a web subnet, and that's going to have a specific address range, and we're tying that to a network security group. So that's all on there, but the other thing is our dependencies. Now, because I'm referencing a network security group inside my subnets in my virtual network, those network security groups need to be created first, so I've specified them here as my depends on. Okay, so that's one of our nested templates. This is almost like doing a separate deployment. In fact, it is. It's doing a whole separate deployment, and because it is, we can also use outputs. So now, as an output, because I don't know up front what my IP address space is going to be, I don't know exactly what the name of my subnet's going to be, I want to output those values of my web app and database subnets so that I can pass those values over to my VMs when I'm building them so my NICs end up in the right places. Okay, so I'm going to output this value from here, and then that's going to become an input into another template. Okay, so let me now create for you the web app and database templates. First of all, this is the type of resource of a deployment, and it's got a name, just like the one we did for the virtual network. It's got an IP version, and now you can see here this is a condition. Now the condition says only true or false. Okay, that's the only value that's permitted. It's Boolean. So that says that, am I going to deploy this? Well, that depends on the input parameter that we provided of the web server. And if this value comes back as true, then we will deploy the web tier. If not, we won't. Okay, so that's how you can control that. Now, a dependency here is nothing, but I did say that we need the output of our virtual network template in order to provide that as an input to our web tier. So why don't I have a depends on? Well, this is the beauty also of ARM templates, is ARM understands inputs and outputs and nested and linked templates. So what I can do here is I can create a subnet as a input parameter to this template, and that subnet has a value referencing the output of the virtual network template, and it knows that it needs it. And since it knows that it needs it, it knows to wait for it. Okay, so let me show you how this works. So this is a reference, and the reference says, look at this deployment, and that deployment just came from the name of this deployment. Okay, so they match. And then I'm referencing the .output section, which we saw down here. This is our output section. And inside the output section, reference the vnetref web, which was vnetref web. And in there, I want to grab the value. So the value is down here, and this is the resource ID string for my web subnet. So I'm passing that as a value into my web tier as I build it. So let me show you what these other values are. Okay, so not only do we have our reference for our subnet here, but we're also pulling in some values from our parameters like username and password, but we're also building a string of some things like our availability set name, and that's exactly like what we had in our availability set. So we're building the same thing, just in a different manner. And then we have some other items that we're pulling in, which are from our variables section. Now, I'm doing this in a few different ways. Firstly, I'm pulling in every template. Now, the reason why I'm pulling in every template, and just to remember, that's all of these things, is because I'm not exactly sure if I'm going to need this further down the line. And since I don't know if I'm going to need that further down the line, I'm just going to pass all the values right now and sort it out later. I could additionally do that with the VM images, for which am I going to deploy Windows or Linux, and I could also do that for the VM sizes, and then I could parse these things on the other side. But I wanted to show you different ways of doing this. So I'm taking all of the templates, but I'm passing only the VM images based on the operating system that you choose up front, which is either Windows or Linux. And then additionally, I'm saying that the size of the system it will deploy is based on the VM size of small, medium, or large, but I'm only going to pull in the size of the web server. Okay, so if I look at my VM size, let's say we pick medium, and then medium, I'm only pulling in this value for deploying my web servers. Okay, so you can parse these things in many different ways. And the values for the app server and database server are exactly the same as what we have here. Now, if you remember, the difference in our three-tiered operation was our web server had a network security group and an application security group, and it also had a load balancer, and it also had that custom script that let me build the web server. So we need to have those values in our web tier, but we don't need them in our app tier or database tier. But the input values are basically all the same. So let me just show you those. Okay, so here's our database one, and you can see we're creating a database availability set. The other values are the same. We're referencing the database subnet, and then we're saying build the VM database size. So they're exactly the same on the app side, just calling out app stuff. So that's our master template. So that is done. So if you look it over here in our outline, we've got a bunch of input parameters. and we'll be referencing some of the variables that's going to build some of the resources. And now we just need to take those values and build out our app server, database server, and web server. So what I'll start with is the app and database because they're pretty much identical. All right, so we are ready to take a look at what we've got here. Now, here's our template link. We're calling out our database template, and that's referenced over here. And then these are our input parameters for that template. So these values all have to have a matching parameter input, which we do. And we're pulling in our secure string. Notice all of your types have to match the number of systems we're deploying. The template that we're pulling in is an object. Okay, so back in our master deployment, we're saying our variables section, we're pulling in this entire thing. And this is a collection of items. So this is an object. Okay, and so that has to be passed in here so it knows to receive this as an object. And same thing with our VM images, but our VM size is just a string. So that is all that we are doing. Dropping in further, our variable section is empty. We don't really need any because we've already parsed these things in our parameters. And then in our resources, we've got the same stuff building out our network card and building out our VM that we had before, so absolutely nothing different from our three-tiered application. What we also have here is I've created a inline or nested deployment just to show you what it looks like, and here is an availability set being done inline. And I'm saying a copy here just because I want to have the name reference so I can easily reference this in the rest of my template. And in the properties has the mode of incremental or complete, just like we did before in the link template. And now we say template. Now, if you remember from back here, when we deployed a template, we had a template link. So there's another difference between the two of nested versus linked. This is a linked template, template link. And this is a nested template. It just says template, and then I'm writing the actual template inside of itself. And that template only has a resource, and that resource is deploy me an availability set. Okay, so that's the two ways of approaching doing linked and nested templates. And then our app server is exactly the same, just replacing all the DBs or database words with app. Now we come to the web server. So it's basically the same, but a little different. Okay, so we have the same input parameters that we had before, but additionally to these parameters, we also have some variables. And this was to reference out the same variables that we had when we were building our three-tiered app so that we could do that deployment of the web server, you know, referencing the file and parsing the data so that we could do our custom script extension. And so we've got the same thing here. So basically, there's all the stuff referencing our file and how we're going to parse that file. And then we have the same custom script extension, exactly the same code that we had before. Additionally to that, we've got our inline or nested template for our availability set. And then we have our load balancer and public IP address because the web server needed these things. And besides that, it's pretty much exactly the same. Now, one thing that I am also capturing here is an output. And I did this because I wanted to show you something in particular. So when you are doing an output, you can make a reference inside the template. And I'm doing this because what I want to capture when this deployment is done is I want to capture the name or the DNS name, the fully qualified name of the website. So that way I don't have to look in the portal to find out what it is. So I want to capture that. So the way we do that is by using a reference. And the reference says, give me the particular resource that you want. And then I'm referencing the API version, because there's two ways to do this. I could specify a particular parameter, or I could say, give me everything. And that would be the command full. So I just wanted the DNS name and the fully qualified name, I should say. So to do that, I specify the resource, and it's got to have the same API set. And then I'm calling the DNS settings section. And then inside the DNS settings section, I'm calling the FQDN so that I can have that as a value that I'm outputting. So where am I going to output this to? So this output comes back to the master, just like it did before. But then I'm going to set this as an output of the overall template. And just like we did before, we're going to specify here an output. And this is the output of our master. So this is how you can pass an output value from inside a linked or nested template back up to the master and then output it from the master so that you can see it at the end and be given the name at the end so that you can actually do something with it, like pull up the website, which is what I'm going to do. We do that also by the reference saying this particular resource or deployment. And then from there, the output, public IP FQDN, and select the value, which is what I had here. Public IP VPN, select the value, which is this guy, pulling in the DNS FQDN, and therefore we are done. So let's kick this deployment off, and we will select our Azure deploy and our Azure deploy parameter, which is currently empty. So now we're going to input our parameters. So I'm going to say that I want all 3 tiers deployed, and I also am going to make an instance count of 2, and we're going to deploy these as Windows. I'm going to make Z99 my prefix. This will be a small environment because I don't really need a large one. This is just a test. And now we need a username and a password. So I will use my favorite username, and I will need a password, which I will reference a key vault and pull in my secret password from there. And then we have these artifacts, which are part of the logic of our template so that we know where things are being deployed. This also is a command that tells the PowerShell script that's running our deployment, if it sees these, push all the files to a storage account, and that storage account is referenced right here. Okay, and if that does not exist, then create it or use that. And I've got multiple storage accounts that I could pick from that are already there, but it doesn't matter. If one does not exist where it's accessible, then it will create one. And then it will generate for me a SAS token on the fly, which is also part of the deployment PowerShell script. So this is basically all we need to do. So we'll kick this off. And this will probably take about 10 minutes or so to build everything out. But what I want to show you while that's cooking is see here what it's doing. It's pushing out all of our files. Okay, so you can see that it starts to build our deployment. Now we have our deployment here. This is our main deployment of Azure. And then we have another deployment that's being spawned, and that is our virtual network. So let's look over at the Azure portal. So in the portal, see resources have already started. We've got 2 deployments going on. And this is our main deployment, our master, and that's using those same inputs that we had set. And you can see there's the generated artifact location where my templates were uploaded to, the SAS token, because it's secure like our password, you cannot see it. And it's deployed our virtual network now, our NSGs and our ASGs, and it has, of course, its own template, which looks exactly like it did when we deployed it, and that had its own inputs. Okay, you see how this all works? And then there are the outputs, and that's our links to our references to our subnets inside our virtual network. So inside our main deployment template, it's deploying the web server, app server, database server at this point, but you can see we've also spawned another one, and that's for our availability set. And this is for doing our availability sets for our web, app, and database layer. So you can see this one shows up here as another deployment, and it's just got a resource type of availability set. So it just does things a little bit differently because it's a inline template. So I guess a good time to point out, we only have one deployment called availability set. We have failures here because the availability set could not be found because the deployment had the same name. So the lesson here is that when you are making a deployment of a nested deployment or a linked deployment, the names all need to be unique. And that's so one does not overwrite another, because Azure doesn't know the difference between you deploying 6 linked or nested templates right now and doing 1 now and 5 later. Okay, so when it sees that you're deploying availability set, it say, okay, well, I've already got one here named availability set, so I'll just overwrite that. So the lesson is to make the names unique. All I have to do to fix this was rename my availability set nested deployments as I did, and then just kick it off again. And you can see what happened to our web and our database. They are back in a deploying state because, again, the same name was there, so it overwrites. Now, this brings up a good point of how can I keep all of these and the history of them even though I've done multiple iterations of this deployment. I'll show you that in just a second. So you can see here, here's the original availability set for our app tier, and here is the new one for our app tier. So now, how can you keep the names unique? So back in our template, so this is how I can keep each one of my deployments unique, by concatenating together the name of the template that I am deploying with the name of the deployment. Now, it shows up here that name has an error because these are what Visual Studio recognizes as the valid subparameters or subselect settings for a deployment function. Now, I know that the deployment name is a valid function, so I'm writing name, and I found that in the Azure documentation. This does work, and I have validated this in the past, so this will totally function even though it does not like the name here. All right, so our deployment has finished, and one of the outputs that we got here was the fully qualified name of our website. So I will bring up a private browser, and we'll go there. And there you go. We've got the name of our Z99 web server, and that's pulled up web VM1. And I will do a reboot on VM1. And we'll come back here, and we'll start refreshing. And you can see we failed over to VM0. And here is web VM0, which I'll perform a restart just for completeness. And now it's unavailable, and then it will fail over to number 1. This has been looking at nested and linked templates for deployments. Now we're going to focus a little more on centralized services. Be sure to subscribe, like the video if it was great. If it sucked, hit that dislike button and hit the notification icon so that you can always find out when we drop a new video, which is roughly about once or twice a week. And leave me a comment below. Let me know what it is that you would like to look at in the future and dig into, and I'll be happy to do that. Happy learning.